This is Shelf Space. Welcome back to the show. Today's episode is a wildcard one as I'm talking with a restaurant consultant who's also a partner in Rob Feeney's revitalized and infamous Le Crocodile restaurant here in Vancouver. Jim Taylor and I talk through the future of food service, hospitality, and the parallels between high-pressure kitchens and the crowded grocery aisle. We explore the messy, fascinating world of food innovation, dig into why the grind isn't always a badge of honor, how Michelin stars can actually be a curse, and the massive opportunity for CPG brands to learn from and partner with world-class chefs. And before we launch in, I want to give a shout out to our Shelf Space partners, Fasken, TD, Pacific Coast Distribution, Rima, Picnic Creative, and yes, even Jim Taylor's Benchmark 60. You can learn more about our sponsors in the show notes below or at shelfspacepodcast.com. Okay, let's dive in. Here's my conversation with Jim. Okay, Jim, so my confession is this. I wrote like 4 or 5 pages of notes, questions I wanted to ask you. And when I reviewed it this morning, I'm like, we are not going to get through this first page. So I think that's a good problem to have. So I'm grateful to have you on Shelf Space. Thanks for making the time to do this. And I'm going to kick you off with the first question. And that is, when you look ahead to the future, what's one food innovation you would love to see in your favorite grocery store?
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Corwin. This is going to be a lot of fun, I think. One food innovation that I'd love to see in a grocery store, and this might sound maybe even a little bit strange, but there's a really cool opportunity for some of the really high-end, really niche type of restaurant concepts to get their product in front of more people. I was in the US last week, and there's a ramen place that dominates one of these markets that I was in. And I went into 2 different grocery stores, and their ramen was in the grocery stores. And I'm thinking, this is like almost a Michelin star restaurant that's also getting their product in front of the masses that can make it at home. And, we've seen lots of restaurants that are they have 100 units and then they put their soup into the restaurants. And that's obviously a good thing. But the small niche market, there's still, I think, really cool opportunity for them to do the same thing.
Yeah. And I know a lot of the sort of the more chain style restaurants will do that with keg sauce or keg burgers or, those, maybe not Cactus Club, but a few others, milestones. But then, of course, translating grocery success, for a restaurant is not easily done. It's like starting from scratch. So I can see it being a tricky play. But I think the plant-based workshop out of North Vancouver that went into sort of the noodle space in grocery, I think they're a great example of that very thing. It's hard. It's not an easy task to do. But I think actually it leads me to my first question really well. And that is, what do you think restaurant leaders can teach leaders in the consumer packaged goods space? Like, where are some of those transferable insights that you think CPG leaders might benefit from?
Well, there's all kinds of discussion happening right now in the restaurant, food service, hospitality space about how to manage rising cost, about proper engineering around menus and how to do things in a way where we're not sacrificing quality and we're not increasing prices by 10, 15, 20% just to manage and negate rising costs. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for those restaurant leaders and executive or chefs and concept people in restaurants to pass on some of that knowledge around how they're either using ingredients differently or they're packaging, really high quality food into a way that doesn't have to cost an insane amount of money to be able to reproduce that food at home. It's just such a hot topic in the actual restaurant space right now is what's happening with rising costs, as it is everywhere else. But the food side of things into CPG, I think there's opportunity there.
And I made the mistake of listening to one of your podcast episodes where you went deep into labor costing. And I don't know how I managed to survive listening to that because I can't apply it and I barely understand it. But it revealed to me just how intense it is for restaurant leaders to make sure that their labor costs are dialed in and accurate and helpful and that people aren't burning out, but yet, their talents are being maximized and that it's complicated. And in CPG, there's plenty of cost of goods, contribution margins, and they, like a lot of food founders deal with spreadsheets all day long. In fact, many of them are craving to get away from their spreadsheets. But the reality is that the math is important. When you look into the kind of the grocery world and that parallel in the food and beverage world from restaurants to grocery, do you feel like there's analysis by paralysis when it comes to how food leaders are handling themselves, or where do you see the opportunities really lying?
So I don't know exactly which episode it was that you listened to. Thanks for listening to it. But if I had to guess, I would think it's the one that is called Fear of Data.
That's it.
And, we got into some really interesting discussion in that episode. And it segues really, really well into your question. That data overwhelm that exists in the spreadsheets and trying to get away from them. I think we talk about this all the time with people, that finding either someone or some tool or some way to more easily interpret the data is really a massive gap, I think, in restaurants and CPG right now, because there's just a flood of information and nobody has time or even sometimes a level of comfort to really be able to interpret what's happening. If you can't interpret, then it's really hard to make decisions, right? And intuition isn't the easiest way to run a business based on.
Yeah, that's so true. I have a question about influencers. And, on the marketing side, we see a lot of TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, superstars making their way in the food space or in food reviews or in cooking, sort of their ad hoc cooking shows or whatever you want to call it. And a lot of marketers in CPG, look to some of these people to get in front of their audiences and create content that's interesting. Why is it that food companies and food manufacturers aren't collaborating more with chefs and with restaurants? Why does it feel like it's such a big disconnect, like they're two very independent silos at times when you would think they would be more integrated? I mean, from the government perspective, the restaurant industry is not the same as food manufacturing. They've really siloed it out there. But even as when it comes to influence and getting traction and getting people excited about something, I feel like chefs would be such a great resource for food companies and beverage manufacturers, but it's just not there, at least not to the degree I would think it would be. Where do you think the disconnect is?
Some of this is just going to be probably a bit of a guess, but, having been in the restaurant business for, 30 years, so much of it comes down to the traditional and unfortunately really widely accepted way of operating for most chefs probably doesn't a lot of either physical or even mental time to take things on like that, right? The grind is a badge of honor in restaurants, unfortunately. There's likely lots of chefs, probably thousands and thousands of really, really talented chefs that could make a huge impact for CPG companies. And they either don't have the time or the, I hate to use, a bit of a cliche word, but the bandwidth to even explore that because they're in the kitchen for 80 hours a week.
Yeah, it's, and, a lot of food manufacturers would feel the same way. They don't have a lot of time or energy or, creative focus to be able to lean into collaborations. And the reality is collaborations typically are kind of costly, especially early on until they've proven themselves as valuable. But it's amazing how, a lot of people kind of chasing influence and they're chasing credibility, but yet they're missing potentially an opportunity of collaborating with someone who's really well respected and has a good reputation and has some talent that they can attribute to it. So are there any chef collaborations that you've seen in the grocery store that really stood out to you as, okay, that one worked?
I don't know of any necessarily off the top of my head, but the ones that just from a more general perspective, the ones that seem to have been able to detach themselves and in a way where they can look for other opportunity, whether it's collaboration or growth of their companies or their business or whatever that might look like. If you look at a cross section of those chefs, they're all very similar, right? They have strong business sense. They have likely very positive, balanced work and personal life. They believe that maybe that, like I was mentioning, the grind thing is not the way that it has to be. So they're actually, there's a very specific type of individual that can manage in the restaurant industry and also explore other opportunities. So I don't know if I have I'll have to get back to you on who it is exactly that I've seen in the CPG space, but it takes a really unique individual to be able to manage both.
We'll get back to the show in just a second, but I want to take a quick moment to tell you about a shelf space partner that I feel brings a lot of value to the food service side of our industry. Benchmark 60 are data-driven, operations-focused consultants who specialize in helping restaurants boost productivity, get labor costs back on track, and increase profit margins. Their approach focuses on improving employee retention and operational efficiency, all without compromising the brand experience. I'm thrilled to have Jim Taylor and the Benchmark 60 group as a part of the Shelf Space family. Their support and influence is playing a vital role in expanding our programming beyond consumer goods and grocery, and I encourage you to check them out and pick up Jim's book at benchmark60.com. Okay, let's get back to the show. a lot of listeners might not exactly know what it is that you do, and you do a lot of things, but foundationally, you've been consulting and advising restaurant leaders for a long time, and you're involved in a lot of restaurant projects. Give us a sense of what's one of the ways that you help the most when a restaurant comes to you and says, all right, we need to figure stuff out. We need to fix something. What problems are you fixing for restaurant leaders?
I could explain this in lots of different ways. And, thanks for the kind words. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, the concept of interpretation of information, where we or I have spent most of my time in the last, number of years with hospitality businesses, hospitality technology companies, even some of the schools and education platforms, is there is a gap between information and operations. And part of it's driven by intimidation. Part of it's driven by advance of technology. Part of it's driven by, again, lack of time. But there's this gap. And so when people, they get some admin time or they get an opportunity to work on, the saying, work on your business instead of working in your business, they get some time to finally sit down and do that. There's often a lot of overwhelm that happens. So where I spend most of my time is in helping hospitality leaders understand how to optimize their business from an information perspective so that they can make better decisions, so they can act quicker, so they can negate rising costs, so they can solve the problems that are causing them to lose sleep, right? And it's typically related to what I would call business model, but it's typically related to things like labor and cost of goods, which eat up almost all of the profit for most restaurants.
And you don't just do that. You also advise and consult advisors and consultants on how to do that, the train the trainer kind of model, which is fantastic. And in food leaders across multiple different sectors that we're talking about here, I think for those that have gained some experience, have sort of been there, done that, got the t-shirt, especially for those that their businesses are maybe maturing a little bit and they've got a little bit more of that time to think about things in a different way or look at their work life in a slightly different way. I hear a lot of them tell me, a lot of founders say, thinking about getting into consulting. What advice would you have for an experienced food leader that's like ready to start putting themselves out there as an advisor or as a consultant, or maybe as an investor where they're sort of put some skin in the game, but they want to contribute to someone else's business, but they haven't really done it in that way before, at least not in a structured way?
A lot of it comes down to, again, I just mentioned this from the business model concept of a restaurant. Right? You have to make decisions that are going to hopefully positively impact the success of the business, right? And for a restaurant, that would be starting out saying, what type of concept are we and what type of items are we going to have on the menu and what do we want the room to feel like? And, it's designing what it is that you want to have happen. And the first piece of advice or recommendation I would make to anyone who wants to start consulting division or arm or business in general would be you have to do the same thing. You have to design what you want it to look like. So, for example, you have to make a decision on, is my service or my business going to be do with, or is it going to be do for? Do for is, I will take this and physically or literally do it for you and come back with a produced result. Do with is, I'm going to teach you how to do it so you can do it for yourself for the rest of however long, right? Teach you to fish so you can feed your family. And that's a line that I see a lot of people get blurred on because they're so used to either being an employee or running their own company. And so they're in this do for model, which is tough to scale. It's tough to grow. It's tough to, do those things. So do with versus do for is the first one that I recommend people spend some time on. The second one is, how am I going to charge for my services? Am I going to try to do this hourly? Am I going to try to be on a project basis or retainer? There's all these different things that people hear and think about. And what I always recommend to people is, since the day that most people started going to work, they were assigned a value, right? Minimum wage or whatever it might be in your first job. And then you try to, climb certain ladders to qualify for maybe more wage or salary, or whatever. The same doesn't apply necessarily when you're trying to provide a service for people. So we always encourage people, and I always speak to people about, the next thing you have to be able to do is demonstrate clear ROI on how you're going to help the business. And then however you structure your fees should be positioned against that. Not, I charge $100 an hour or $200 or whatever the number is that you think might make sense, right? And because it's kind of a guessing game at that point. But there are specific types of what is my concept that would apply to starting any company. And that would be the same from a consulting perspective.
Could we get our lawyers to price like that on result? That'd be great.
Well, you know what? It's funny that you say that because so often I've said this to companies that I've worked with. I've said this to people that have been starting consulting businesses. Nobody wants to get a bill from a lawyer that's for an 11-minute phone call. And in order to get really good at the advisory side of things, you have to be able to remove the I don't want to call them because I don't want to get a bill feeling. And hourly pricing creates a lot of sticky, situations when it comes to that.
Yeah, certainly does. Let's jump back into the kitchen for a second. So my background, I spent a number of years when I was a lot younger in kitchens, and started my Red Seal, and I bailed after about a year. Every chef I knew was an asshole. And I'm like, I don't want that life. I didn't see any hope. I was a couple of years before Jamie Oliver really took the scene. So I didn't know that there could be hope. But one of the things that over the years is I've kind of watched and been curious about is that in CPG, the innovation pipeline, the smaller the business, the potentially the quicker the innovation pipeline can be. You have fewer barriers. You can be more nimble with what your plans are. Of course, you don't have the money to scale them or actually do anything with it, but your innovation pipeline, has the potential to be pretty quick. And then the food companies that are bigger is harder. In restaurants, there's daily specials. A chef can be like, I'm doing this today, right now. And whenever I see trends or things that are really coming in quick and consumers and people are interested in talking about it, sometimes it comes out of the grocery store and sometimes it comes out of the restaurants. And there's this interesting sort of tit for tat of where these innovations are going to come from. We are in yet another protein push in the grocery store. There's protein going in everything, including water. But we're not seeing a protein push in restaurants. We're seeing meat getting a lot smaller. And so there's this weird sort of dynamic going on. When you see food trends coming in the restaurant space, do you feel like restaurants are lagging or restaurants are leading the charge?
The best restaurants in the world are always going to lead the charge on that type of stuff, the innovation and service model and those types of things. But in general, in North America right now, the restaurant space is unfortunately having to be very reactive from a trend perspective. You talk about the meat side of things in the restaurant space, and because of what's happened from a cost perspective over the last 5 years, there's only most restaurants, unless they have incredibly strong purchasing power, they're left with one of two decisions when it comes to things like protein. And that's either raise the price by a whole bunch or reduce the portion size. And that really impacts the guest experience. I was at a mainstream restaurant in Edmonton just a few weeks ago, and there was a steak on their menu that 4 years ago would have been $45, and it was $72. I mean, that's not a little bit of price increase. That's, we're talking, call it 40% increase in the last few years. So, and that's based on pressure. That's not based on the fact that the customer is demanding a really good strip loin at $72.
Yeah, so tricky. What is it about the cost of food stuff that when people get to the grocery store, they will, if they always love their decadent item, their luxury, they still tend to buy them. I mean, there's a flood of premium products and indulgent products are coming into the market. There's no shortage of that. That segment, though maybe some are making a lot less money at it, the reality is that it's still attracting a lot of people. But in restaurants, it seems like the quick service and the sort of the more affordable restaurant spaces, they seem to be the ones that are kind of, there seems to be more of them holding on, and the ones that are sort of higher up the food chain, literally, just don't seem to be sticking around as long or managing so well. What is it about that gap where the grocery store is full of premium and the restaurant space is struggling on that side?
The restaurant space, for sure. The quick serve and the fine dining they're performing relatively well in most markets because there's protection there in different ways. The mid-market of the restaurant space is where the real challenge exists because, again, some of this comes down to the interpretation of data and having a really good understanding of what's happening and what you can do about it. But again, you see that mainstream restaurant that used to charge $45 and now they're charging $72 for that same item. They've made a conscious choice that they're comfortable losing some guests in order to cover the cost of that product and charge customers more, meaning that they probably have an increase in revenue year over year. And it's not because they're serving more guests. Their guest count is, in a lot of cases, likely down. They're making up for it in pricing. And so, where fine dining and quick serve are actually seeing consistent year-on-year growth or maintenance, and they're working on battling cost. That mid-market is, in most cases, losing guest count, and they're remaining successful, hopefully, based on pricing. So it's a totally different game. And unfortunately, like I said, it's a conscious choice that those mid-market people have to make. Are we going to try and serve more people and work really, really hard or harder to maintain? Or are we comfortable losing some guests because we've priced out of their comfort zone? It's a tricky one in the restaurant space right now, for sure.
There's a book I'm reading, just started actually, called, I think, Unreasonable Hospitality. And I'm only maybe 20, 30 pages in, but it's already just grabbed me by the eyeballs. I'm loving it. And it speaks to the experience part of the restaurant life. And that's where a lot of food manufacturers, they don't get that option to create an experience around their product. They hopefully have matched their product with the right experience, and hopefully their brand and their marketing and communications and everything can sort of help amplify that as best as possible. But the reality is that, and you just said it, like maybe a restaurant can't compete for steak meals because their steaks are more expensive than, maybe a competitor, but yet they can augment that pricing variable with service, with customer care, with friendliness, with, going the extra mile, kind of human to human contact. And I get excited when I see brands, and maybe Midday Squares is an example of a consumer packaged good where they are working as best they can to create experiences around the brand, around sort of the vibe. And they've picked their villain of going after Hershey's, and they've got their community around that. And is that what it takes for a packaged brand to really lean into the experience to try to kind of cross that divide? I mean, it's restaurants they live and breathe off service. So I'm curious to know, what is it you see in the restaurant space that could translate to manufacturing?
So first of all, the book you're reading is fantastic. I mean, it's one of the best books that's ever been written about restaurants. There's another one that you should add to your list, and it's called Uncommon Service. It's by a woman named Frances Fry. And there's a really good example here of, I think, how CPG can keep up with some of that, the restaurant industry's ability, like you said, to overcome pricing objection with service. So Frances talks a lot about that in order to be great at one thing, you have to intentionally be bad at something else. You can't be great at everything. I mean, as much as we all want to just be, win at everything, right? You have to be bad at one thing intentionally to be great at something else. And some of the examples that she uses are things like, there's a bank in the United States that she talks about where they provide the absolute best service out of any bank in the market. Their hours of operation are the best. They're open on weekends. They have a person specifically answer the phone. There's no automation, all that stuff. But their fees are extraordinarily high compared to their competitors. They're the worst at pricing on purpose in order to be the best at service, right? So, how that might be able to sort of translate into the CPG perspective. It's like, if we have the best quality product that you can possibly get, then we're probably the worst at price or value. Or you could go the other way, right? You could be the best at price and maybe the worst at quality. But it changes the discussion when you frame it that way about what are we going to be bad at intentionally so that we could be better than our competitors at something else.
A lot of leaders would struggle having that as a line item. Okay, everybody, what are we going to be really bad at this month?
Right. The other example, just to provide one more, because I always find this one really interesting, is I believe it's Progressive Insurance. They are the absolute best at service from an insurance perspective. Their agents are placed in cars. They don't have a desk. They drive around all day. So they have the best rates as well, the worst rates as well as, similar to the bank. The reason for that, though, the way they can afford it is because their agents are in vehicles. They get to the scene of the accident faster, or get to the scene of the accident at all compared to their competitors, which means that their rate of insurance fraud is almost zero. How do you have a fraudulent claim when the agent comes to the site, right? Immediately. So their fees are worst in class, their service is best in class, and the trade-off is that they have, some of these other things. So it's a fantastic conversation for any leader in any business to have, is what are we going to be the best at, and what are we actually going to be okay with not being good at?
And restaurants have this mythical lore around Michelin stars and rankings and sort of the best of and the top 50s and all that kind of stuff. And in food manufacturing, there's industry awards and there's some of that stuff as well, but it's not regarded to the same degree. I'm curious to know, especially like where we are here in British Columbia, Michelin kind of came through last year. They handed out a lot of like stars. I don't know. They didn't have a lot of stars. They had a lot of like recommendations, and they sort of like, grew the Michelin brand a little bit out here. Just staying in restaurants for a second, is this a good thing that Michelin's handing out awards and accolades and high fives to everybody? Where does this take the restaurant business when it comes to everyone trying to rank as high as they can?
Yeah, there's a bit of a line in the sand on that one, that people sort of stand on one side or the other of. My personal stance on the Michelin thing is that it's a very slippery slope. Any of those top 50, those types of lists are just fantastic. Restaurants that get on those, they get a boost in revenue. They get likely a good opportunity to hire more great people. It's really, really good from a marketing perspective. The challenge with the Michelin part is there's like a psychological thing that happens with people who own and operate restaurants. And I have personal experience with this with our team, is that it becomes this obsession that people will go so far and work so hard to try to accomplish because of the impact that it can have on the business and the reputation, that it can be actually quite damaging sometimes for the people and their experience, and even things like mental health. So it's a very slippery slope. Michelin, from a marketing and reputation perspective, is fantastic, and I wish they would do more in Vancouver. I just wish that people could accomplish those accolades without having to go quite so hard and quite so far to accomplish it.
And you just mentioned mental health. In my experience in the restaurant world, there's plenty of sad stories, and where you're seeing people just work really hard, work too much, and their mental health takes a beating. And this same seems to be true in consumer packaged goods, where founders and food leaders they're wearing a million hats. They're trying to do a million things, and they feel all the pressure. What is it from a mental health perspective that you think food leaders would really benefit from leaning into in a way to sort of protect themselves and protect their future and the legacy that they're trying to create for themselves in their business?
I have a sort of a personal belief on this, and something that I'm very passionate about, and I try to make a positive impact whenever I can. And I'm a big sports fan in most sports. I just, love the competitive side of things, and, I'm a fan and that kind of thing. But a few years ago, we were doing some sort of research on things, and we sort of tripped across this concept of that every professional sport league in the world has a load management strategy in place to protect their athletes from burnout and injury. And specifically looking in the mirror and at the industry I've spent most of my life in, the restaurant industry has no such thing. But you don't hear very many people that are saying things like, we're going to actually measure your workload to protect you from burnout and either physical or mental injury. But you hear stories about chefs that, they've either burned themselves incredibly bad, or they've cut themselves incredibly bad, or they have mental health challenges in front of house as well. But I think that that's one thing that the restaurant industry could benefit from, and I'm sure CPG as well, is that concept of let's actually proactively work towards protecting our people from a workload perspective so that they can perform, right? The same way that all these pro sport leagues do, because the athletes are the asset in restaurants and CPG. The same applies.
And I think when I get excited about seeing founders thrive, it's usually not just because what they do is awesome. It's the way in which they do it. And you can see stress on people. You can hear it in their voice, like you can hear the cold that I'm fighting in my voice, that they wear their stress. And it is hard to get excited and to champion and to be behind someone that, even though you love what they do, you're worried like, well, if I help them and they end up doing more of this, are they just going to become worse? Or do you just feel like you're kind of piling on expectations or kind of making their situation even more unhealthy? So yeah, I get excited when I see leaders that have some balance. They have some hobbies outside of their work or their business, and they're leaning into some of the areas of their personal life that kind of make them well-rounded. And like my reference about chefs, I didn't know any well-rounded chefs when I was 21 and working in kitchens and wielding knives. It's a different kind of scenario for sure. One of my hopes, and one of the reasons why I love that we're talking and that you're involved in shelf space in 2026, is that I do want to try to break down some of the barriers or these silos between the food service and restaurant, hospitality world, and CPG and grocery. And maybe I'm venturing into territory I don't fully understand or know yet, but I see a gap, and I see There's so much like-minded people. There's so many shared interests and shared passions. And a lot of us are working with the same ingredients or the same business issues. They might, look a little different on the outside, but on the inside, they're so similar. So I'm glad we can have this chat and kind of go through it. My final question for you is your favorite grocery store anywhere in the world. Which one?
Oh, so I grew up in Alberta, and I grew up going to the regular grocery store that my parents went to. You kind of just tag along to get groceries sometimes, right? Anyway, I moved to British Columbia when I was in my early 20s, and I was amazed at the time. I was amazed by Thrifties. I just had it just felt different when you went into Thrifties than it did when you went into one of the other sort of mainstream grocery stores, at least growing up. And, even just things like I could go and get a marinated piece of really high quality beef or something like that. That was just seemed different to me. And I always just felt like that was a good one. I mean, I travel to the States as much as whenever I can. And I enjoy going to certain places in the US, and I always look forward to going to Trader Joe's. And the thing that, a lot of people love Trader Joe's, and that's all, there's lots of good things to love. But the thing for me that I love about that business isn't so much the fact that it's a good grocery store. I love the fact that they've embraced that we are Trader Joe's, and you're going to find things here that are only here, and they're our product, and they're maybe proprietary. But I also love the way that their people interact with you. So we were talking about this, the service side of things at CPG and that. So a quick story. I was at Trader Joe's with my wife when she was about 8 months pregnant. And we were unloading all of our stuff and going through the cash register or the cashier and getting ready to, pack things up and go home. And all of a sudden, the person working at the cash said, "Hold on one moment, I'll be right back." Didn't say why, nothing happened. He just said, "Hold on one moment, I'll be right back." Then he leaves and comes back. We didn't know why he left or anything. 30 seconds later, the manager of the store comes over to us and says, "Congratulations," and gives my wife flowers. He didn't ask if she was pregnant. He just said, "Congratulations, and here you go. These are on us." And I thought, I've never had an experience like that in a grocery store. And I can guarantee you that both my wife and I will probably never forget that happened.
That's unbelievable. So good. Well, you win. No one brought me flowers. Wait, I wasn't pregnant.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't get them either, but yeah.
No, you just maybe got a glancing look. Okay. Jim, thank you for your time. Thanks for being on Shelf Space, and thanks for everything you do for founders and leaders in the food world. And we'll get this hospitality and CPG mashup. We'll get it going real good. So I appreciate you being on the ride.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shelf Space. If you like what you hear, I would be eternally grateful for a 5-star rating and a quick share on social. Your support means the world to me and our partners, TD, Fasken, Rima, Pacific Coast Distribution, Picnic Creative, and Benchmark 60. For bonus content and resources from our sponsors, go to shelfspacepodcast.com. I'm Corwin Hiebert. I'm glad we're on this rocket ship together. I'll see you in the future.